Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kent City Council Workshop. Today is Tuesday, July 21st. For those of you that are joining us, we are broadcasting live on Kent TV 21, Facebook, the Kent channel, and YouTube, Kent TV 21. This is a remote meeting, again, due to the coronavirus emergency. So welcome to everyone. We have all council members present, and we will go ahead and get started on our agenda. We have two items today, and the first item is the Transportation Master Plan, which we also call the TMP, and I'd like to welcome April Delchamps to give our presentation this evening. Welcome, April.
Thank you very much. So good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to update you on the Transportation Master Plan, or TMP. I'm, as Council President Troutner introduced, and April Delchamps for the city's transportation planner, and also on the phone with me is Emily Alice Gearhart and Kendra Breland with Fear and Pierce. Next slide, please. Tonight we want to provide an update on three important topics. The first is incorporating equity and race into the TMP. The next is the financial outlook for the TMP. And finally, the last is the project development list. And I'm going next slide, and I'll turn it over to Emily Alice.
Thanks, April. Hi, everyone. Good evening. We wanted to start by kicking things off with letting you know how much hard work has been done over the past couple months. So next slide, please. So just a brief overview of what we have been working on. So the staff and the consultant team have continued developing the project list. You'll remember a few months back, feels like a few years ago, we visited City Council and adopted the project goals. So we've used those along with the project metrics to begin refining the project list. And this has been no small endeavor. So staff have done a really diligent job, a great job, collaborating with many different departments to refine that quite lengthy potential project list based on some factors that we'll detail tonight. They include feasibility, professional expertise, and other criteria. So, you know, in a perfect world, we would have loved to have provided regular updates in person to our stakeholder advisory group, but we wanted to make sure to provide regular updates to keep them engaged. So we've done that via email over the past couple months. So with that, I'm going to move on. Actually, next slide, please. So kicking things off, we understand that this is a really tumultuous time in our country, and it's really important now more than ever that the TMP recognizes race and equity in a meaningful way. So we wanted to highlight how this plan is shaped with this lens and how we've incorporated this since we kicked off this project. So next slide, please. So this is an image you've seen before we've brought to council, just to remind the group that we often hear the terms equality and equity used in similar discussions or sometimes accidentally interchangeably, but we wanted to highlight the distinction. So in the top part of the image, you can see everyone receiving the same size bicycle, regardless of their, personal unique needs. And that doesn't work for everyone. You're either uncomfortable or you physically cannot ride a bicycle in this example. But when we think about equity, we're not thinking about that same size bicycle. We're thinking about, what are folks' individual needs. And, as this applies to the TMP, we're thinking about community needs and not a one size fits all approach. So we are tailoring especially to communities across the city and specifically to underserved communities. Thank you. So as a reminder, here are the 5 TMP goals. These include connectivity and options, safety and health, placemaking, strategy, and stewardship. So we just wanted to highlight that connectivity and options. We've always had equity at the forefront, and even if the word equity is not specifically used, it is in the forefront of discussion. So here we have in connectivity and options, expand and strengthen the multimodal network, specifically walking, biking, and transit, to increase options for those who have fewest opportunities. So we could spend months, if not years, discussing who has the fewest opportunities and what that specifically means. But we've done a diligent job engaging community members through the Stakeholder Advisory Group, as well as the Cultural Communities Board, to come up with a shared understanding of how that translates into this TMP. So understanding that this is extremely foundational for the plan. If we can move to the next slide, please. How are equity and race considered throughout the TMP? So of course, we're understanding baseline conditions, demographic data, understanding where folks are living and what those specific challenges may be for mobility and access. In addition, as I mentioned before, we're incorporating equity into performance metrics to help prioritize the project list. In addition, we are striving for an equitable public outreach process, specifically engaging with underserved communities and people who may have been overlooked or not as familiar with the public process, and need to make sure that we're hearing voices that are representative of the community. In addition, this doesn't end with the TMP once it's adopted. We want to make sure to set up the city for success in understanding, how projects are implemented and what communities are reaping the benefits of this plan. Next slide. So how has this translated into project evaluation? So a few months ago, we brought to council a list of 20 performance metrics that were used in our project evaluation. We just wanted to highlight this one. So this performance metric was used to award points for projects that specifically provide safety and access benefits for youth, seniors, low-income households, limited English households, people with disabilities, and people of color. So this is based on census data that we have available. And as we have shown before, we mapped where folks live. And then when we went through the project list, we took a look at bicycle, pedestrian, and transit projects to receive points based on their location within those communities. So this translated to a higher score for a project that benefited these modes in these locations. Any questions about this? If not, we can keep moving to the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, this is really important to our public outreach process. So city staff attended 2 cultural communities workshops to get a better understanding of how equity considerations are playing out in the city today, and to help inform our understanding of equity and how to define transportation equity and race, as well as 2 more additional workshops to keep engaging with those communities. And then we outreach to traditionally underserved populations. And, I think it's really important to recognize that what we think may work may not reach everyone we had hoped to. So about halfway through the first round of outreach, we did some course correcting and realized that we were hearing from a lot of people and getting good feedback. But when we compared that to city demographics, we weren't anywhere close to what those aspirations were. So we took some time to think through how can we meaningfully engage folks. And so in addition to some regularly scheduled events, we had city staff organize and attend 9 in-person community events and 2 City of Kent board meetings, as well as one-on-one outreach to reach communities, including low-income housing complexes, 15 Black-owned businesses, organizations, and places of worship. So in addition to those events and those one-on-one outreach processes, we also identified locations, days of the week, and times to get the most participation from diverse communities and representatives. So we had the project team attend library pop-ups, and those were coordinated with events where we might have diverse audiences, such as bilingual story times, ESL practice classes, citizenship classes, computer help clinics, things like that. And then, of course, we also made sure to provide language and translation available at these events. So with that, I think we're ready to pass it over to Kendra for a funding update.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And I know council members have already received some updates on funding. So I'm going to keep this very brief because I know the big focus tonight is really talking about kind of the projects, but it's important to kind of lay the foundation as funding landscape for Kent's TMP certainly sets the foundation for what we can realistically plan for. So let's start with some stark realities. First off, I know it's not lost on anyone on the council that city has a lot of needs. Transportation is just one of many of those needs. And so while it's my professional focus, I know you guys are thinking about a lot of different needs that are really important, and transportation needs really need to be balanced. But from the transportation funding landscape, it's important to keep in mind that current funding for transportation, we're not even keeping pace in terms of taking care of what we have today. So when we look at what those needs are for maintaining pavement and sidewalks and ADA facilities and keeping good upkeep of your signals and your markings and addressing safety needs, there's currently a $13 million unfunded need. And over time, that's really grown into a large maintenance backlog. And so something the city's already identified is that there's a $284 million backlog. Just again, these aren't the big capital projects. These are the projects to keep your system operating well and serving your community. So let's go to the next slide and talk about kind of revenue trends. I'm not going to dwell on kind of any of the items specifically on this chart. You guys have the memo and the information in your packet, but really the key piece of information here is looking at, there's lots of unknowns. You see lots of question marks. So these are the sources that fund your transportation system today. So in looking at these funding sources, you'll see there's a lot of question marks. We don't know kind of where they are. And for those sources of funding that you are using for transportation today, many of those arrows are going down. So that really does paint a stark picture of for funding of transportation. And one kind of caveat here, I got a message from staff. I realize our memo is still going through kind of the review process, so I apologize that is not in your packet today. But I think, you know, these slides here kind of show our hand from the consultant side, kind of some of the funding trends and the headwinds that are facing Kent's transportation funding landscape today. So if we can go to the next slide. So one thing that's clear is if we do want to deliver a transportation master plan that is able to achieve many of the goals that Emily Alice was talking about earlier and that we've heard strong support for in the community, is that new funding sources are going to be necessary. Our team has brainstormed what some of those funding sources might be. I'm not here to promise that any of these, I'm not here to promise that any of these funding sources are going to move forward, but these are some of the options that are available to you between property lid lift, transportation benefit districts, sales and use tax, real estate excise tax, and updates to your impact fee. These are some of the ways that you could potentially update your transportation system. But again, and fund new projects. But again, these sources, all of them are going to take effort. And to support them, all of them would require a strong case, a real benefit for why the public would want to kind of fund these either through increased taxes or other mechanisms. And I do believe someone from city staff wants to kind of chime in on this slide.
So one of the things right now, there is a lot of competing priorities, and frankly, the economic outlook is not great. One of the things about the Transportation Master Plan, it is a 20-year plan. So as we're thinking through some of these potential options if we choose to move forward and with the project list that would require some of these options. Is this isn't something we have to enact next year or even the year after that. This is based on, as we kind of keep going through, is as the economy improves, this may be an option in order to achieve the project list that is envisioned and that will advance the goals the most.
Okay, thank you for that, April. So again, these are ways that if you want to fund more capital, these are some potential ways to do so. So if we can go to the next slide. I think it's important to just kind of share some of these caveats. So first of all, again, reiterating that we recognize that transportation is just one of the many needs in the city, but that generating new revenues would be necessary to be able to deliver some of these projects that we'll be talking about tonight, and that in order to be able to generate new revenue sources, we recognize that a strong case would need to be built. Just looking at what you have today of those sources that I included on the previous slide, the one that doesn't require any sort of voter approval is update of your impact fees. That has been a mechanism that really has, the city has leveraged to deliver transportation projects over the last decade. We do encourage that as a continued way to make sure that new development is paying its way, and making sure that the cost of building and expanding your transportation system as is necessary for growth, that's a shared cost. But it's also important to recognize that source has its limits. As of right now, transportation impact fees only generate about $1 million a year. And the list so over a 20-year period, that's maybe 20 million in transportation capital. So there's a lot of other sources that are going to have to be kind of pieced together to deliver your transportation system. But a benefit of transportation impact fees is that they are a source that can be used to match grants. And currently, of the city's revenue sources, they're really the only dedicated source for matching grants, which again, grants are a great source. I'm confident that with the list of projects and the level of thought that the city has put into its transportation projects, I think you're going to be pretty grant competitive. But at the same time, grants don't fund 100% of projects. They tend to only fund about half of a project. So thinking through a very careful approach to paying for your transportation system is very, very important. So if we can go to kind of, I think the last slide we have here on funding, it's just kind of some of these takeaways in terms of what this means for the TMP. One, we need to be very realistic about what we can afford. So that's why we are kind of starting on this funding strategy early and doing that alongside the project list discussion. We're not just developing a project list and then going, oh, how much does this cost? It's really important that we're doing these two pieces together. City, as I mentioned, you have a transportation impact fee program. We think there's some real opportunities to update and reorient that program to make sure that it's delivering on the types of capital projects that we're talking about as a part of the TMP and that we're going to start talking about tonight. And then last but not least is really thinking creatively about our funding sources and making sure that we're exploring partnerships. We know King County Metro and Sound Transit have partnered really effectively with the City of Kent. So thinking about both those agency and neighborhood partnerships, as well as partnerships with private entities and other stakeholders within the community. So with that, I think we better switch over to kind of our next topic, which is related to the project list development and refinement. So if we can go to the next slide, although I love seeing the children there. So I just wanted to kind of start this discussion, but I'm going to hand it off to April very quickly and just reminding you where we've been. So as a council, we've talked to you about just kind of all the different sources of projects that we've been looking to really kind of develop this initial project list that we're looking at tonight. We looked at all of your adopted city plans. We've also done a fair amount of technical analysis looking at safety needs and needs to meet the multimodal level of service. Again, those are items that we've shared at previous council meetings, and they've helped us inform really what are those needs to really accommodate folks traveling by different modes, whether you're walking or biking, taking transit, driving, making sure that we're accommodating those modes. And then we've also, as April and Emily Ellis have already mentioned, we've gone out to the community. So really those desires and needs that have been expressed by the community, that's informed the development of kind of an unexpanded, unprioritized list of projects that initially was up very close to the 500 project line, number. And so next I'm going to pass it over to April, who can talk about how that project list has been winnowed into something a bit more manageable.
So thank you, Kendra. So from here, we had a very large project list that was obviously unaffordable. And so staff was tasked, and that staff from economic community development, from parks and public works, was going through the list and having a better understanding of where the projects are, how they may group together, but more importantly, how they advance the goals that were adopted by the city council. So staff from all those departments review the projects through the lenses of those adopted goals. Project feasibility, we got from outreach and also from other areas, we get some ones that were not really possible. Also public outreach, we heard a lot from the public, and we heard a lot about what they wanted and where they wanted it. Economic impact, equity, and other factors like funding and which projects were a good fit for grants. Next slide, please. So projects identified from that big, back one. One more. The other direction.
Forward instead of back.
Yep. That one, perfect. So projects were identified from that project list of 500 that advanced the goals the most. And we looked at where those projects were. We had a lot of projects that was a sidewalk gap alongside a proposed bicycle facility and next to an intersection that needed improvements. So we grouped all those 500 projects into a total of 148 corridors, and most of them are based on one single roadway. There is one project that is not. So staff and consultants applied the performance measures to 136 of those quarters. 8 of the quarters we did not apply performance metrics because they were either complete, so they were in a plan and they were have been completed since it was adopted and since it got on our list, or they were an existing transportation program for like operations and maintenance. So once the performance measures were applied, staff had still had a pretty big job to do. They needed to look at it, and these 148 quarters down to 136 were still a lot of projects, and they were still frankly overwhelming even for the staff level. So we reviewed these projects. We wanted to have a better understanding of how they prioritized. We wanted to have a better understanding of what projects from our perspective were important, whether they were projects that were in the pipeline that were currently funded. But we also wanted to look at other factors like the local road safety plan, and we looked at factors like what was in the transportation improvement program, the 6-year plan. So from that, next slide, please. We identified 34 quarters. Those 34 quarters hit all the marks. They were in the top tier for either all the project corridors, so in the top third of the list. We did it by sub areas, and some areas had lower scoring projects because of just geography. And so there were top scoring projects and corridors for the sub areas. But some of the projects were also, as we mentioned, were projects that were identified for other reasons. So that comes to the last step that we wanted to review. And one of the things that we came back around and talked about was what was not considered and what did we miss? So staff and Kent leadership identified one critical issue. The project list should be a balanced multimodal project list that serves all modes. And the 34 project corridors that we had identified as being those prominent corridors that were critically important were predominantly bicycle and pedestrian projects. So we, at the staff level, sat back and tried to understand what we had missed. So the solution from staff was to make sure and go back to that large project list of 500 and identify critical congestion mitigation and safety projects in the city that weren't included in the last step, in the last where prioritization was applied. These projects that we identified, of which there was only 24, so not a significant big list, were then compared to those corridors that we had identified, those 34 top corridors. And we incorporated 16 of the projects into the already prioritized project list, the corridors. And then we have 8 projects that we had that didn't really fit well. And so we put that on a supplementary project list. And a lot of this information, since it's, and though it's a long process and is very detailed, is also included in the project packet. That project packet includes those top 34 corridors, as well as those supplementary corridors, and then a key of sorts to help you work through what a lot of the columns mean. And I wanted to pause here to give you a chance to ask questions and anything else.
Are there any questions for April or Kendra? Councilmember Larmer, do you have a question or comment?
I guess just I'm wondering, are we going to discuss, is this the opportunity to ask about individual projects, or is that going to be a little bit later?
That's going to be a little bit later
Okay.
because the process was so intensive. We've been looking at this project list, the first initial expanded project list we finalized and developed in January. So there was a lot of process internally between departments to kind of get to this point. And I wanted to make sure that I brought the city council along to understand how we got here and how we really applied the adopted goals and performance measures that were approved.
Thank you. Councilmember Boyce, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Back up just a little bit. I didn't want to interrupt you earlier. You mentioned something about possibility of what we could do as far as raising the transportation impact fee. So wondering if you could talk a little more about just what the cost of that is, and compared to our other neighbors, what is our impact fee according to our surrounding neighbors?
That's a perfect question. That's actually, when we begin working on the impact fees in earnest on this project, which is kind of a forthcoming task once we have a better sense of kind of the projects that you have, we will certainly report on kind of how Kent compares to its neighbors and other kind of analogous cities in the region, because I think, certainly we can look to Des Moines and Tukwila and, kind of all of your neighbors of what they're charging. The other is to think about what your needs are and what your role is within the region, because you guys certainly have some unique characteristics in terms of the types of industries that are in Kent, the types of facilities. So that will certainly be kind of, one of our foremost considerations.
So I'm not sure I understand your answer. So how soon can we see that data? I mean, as I look at the new funding mechanism, right, around the property tax and the benefit district and the real estate, I mean, I think the only one, in my opinion, that probably could tweak would be the transportation impact fee. So maybe where it's April sometime soon, I'd be interested in, and I hope my other council members as well too, is what is our cost today compared to our neighbors. So
okay. And may I just want a clarifying question on that. We can report certainly on potential rates compared to neighbors. And then it sounds like you're also potentially interested in how much potentially could be generated by that source.
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
If we were gonna do it, I mean, to me, that's the only level that I see could be poor. I mean, I don't see anything around the property tax or the TBD. I think those is a tough target, where the impact fee may be something that you can do if it fits in with our neighboring cities. So thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
One thing we were asking about timing. So we are next scheduled to come to the City Council workshop on the 15th of September. The highlight of that workshop will be hearing about the public outreach on the project list and which projects were the critical corridors that are the most important to be in the TMP. But the other side of that piece is we'll be reporting some of those more finite details when it comes to the financial plan on what it looks like compared to our neighbors and what our actual budget, for a lack of a better way of saying it, for the plan is.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, April. Thanks, Kendra. Any other questions or comments? All right, looks like we can move on.
Sorry, I was muted. Next slide, please. So I am going to turn this over to Emily Alice to kind of kick off and run through this project list, the details that are critically important at this point.
Thanks, April. So I know this is a very exciting part of the presentation, so I'll make sure we get to the meat of the example projects fairly soon. But we just wanted to give a little bit of background to how we are thinking about these projects. As you can see in your packet, there are 119 projects currently, and these are identified on 42 corridors across the city. And the types of projects we'll get to in a minute, including bicycle and pedestrian, congestion mitigation projects, and safety improvements. But we are thinking about the city in terms of these 6 sub areas, and this helps us have a little bit more manageable and digestible review of projects and how they interact across the city. So we have these 6 areas, which we'll talk about in a minute, but these correspond with the some areas, as we're terming them, in your packet. So you'll see that having one individual map per packet, per sub area. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to take a minute to give you an idea, paint the picture for what types of projects you're going to see in that packet. So when we think about bicycle improvements, this could take on a variety of different forms. And as a planner myself, I'm guilty of using some of these, jargony, plannerese words. So just here are a few images of things that you'll see in the packet. Whether it's a bike boulevard on a low volume, low speed road, or a traditional striped bike lane. So there's Southeast 256th Street, or if it's not in the roadway like a bike lane, a physically separated bikeway or shared use path. So we have the Kent Trail Connector as an example of that. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have pedestrian improvements. I think we're all understanding what I mean when we say sidewalk, but here's some other examples of pedestrian improvements that are included in the project list that make it safer and more comfortable to walk in Kent. So this could be a signalized crossing, like an RFB, a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, some sort of restriping, some sort of crossing improvement. Next slide, please. And then we've got congestion mitigation projects. So these could be an auto improvement that improves signal timing or intersection improvements like listed above, or a more physical capacity enhancement like a roundabout. Next slide, please. And then just rounding it out, we have safety projects, which of course are beneficial when they're separating modal conflict points. So these could include bike, ped, auto, transit projects that improve the safety and livability of the community. So here's some examples as well. So I know I've gone over that quickly, but I do want to make sure we get to our projects. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is the first sub area we wanted to give a chance to walk through. And just to orient you, we do plan to walk through each of the sub areas one by one and allow time for questions. I know you haven't had a lot of time to digest the project list, so you don't have to ask every question now, but we wanted to just go over some example projects to help orient you and give you an idea of some of the things you'll come across in the packet. So here's some examples. So we've identified, you can see the ID in the packet. So DSA 1, the downtown sub-area action plan area. So we have sidewalks on Russell Road. So these would be filling sidewalk gaps about from Meeker Road to James Street. Another example project, we have a buffered bike lane and pedestrian improvements on James Street. So this is a quite intense project. So this is split up into 2 projects that are both on the same corridor. So, you know, when I'm saying project here, I'm thinking of example corridors that we're talking about. So just a disclaimer about that. So I also wanted to touch on Meeker Street. Of course, we want to be consistent with what's already been planned and the design standards for Meet Me on Meeker. So there's a shared use path included on Meeker Street, as well as a road diet, a 4 to 3 lane road diet to provide room for multimodal facilities and a new signal. And then just lastly on our list of examples, Central Avenue planning study. This would examine traffic speeds, evaluate sidewalk gaps, safety improvements, things like that to improve mobility and access on Central Avenue. So with that, I just wanted to take a moment to pause and see if we have any questions about the downtown area.
So any questions about downtown? All right, I'm not seeing any microphones or hands raised, so.
And before you transition this slide, Emily Alice, I mean, just to, you know, kind of reiterate to council members, these are the types of projects that are within the downtown sub area that are scoring well according to kind of those performance metrics and kind of that process that April was reviewing. This is what's coming out of it. So this presentation is kind of just orienting you to kind of what the results of this project, what this process is resulting in, the types of projects that are highest priority. And within your packet, of course, there's an even more expansive list of projects, but didn't sound like there were questions. So we can maybe, Emily Alice, go on to the next sub area.
Just really quickly, great clarification on, you know, because we've seen this over and over again, how you guys prioritize that. And I remember how you score things. So that's good to know that that has been a helpful tool in determining what should be on this list.
Absolutely, thanks for that. So now we get to Midway. So we have identified, once again, some key corridors and example projects. So this includes I-5 and the 272nd interchange, which would construct roundabouts and bike ped facilities. And then we also have converting the roadway from 2 to 3 lanes on South 359th to 60th. I think that's supposed to say 259th, sorry, across I-5. And then we have new streets near the future light rail, Link light rail station. So that's ID5. And then a conversion of Military Road from 2 to 3 lanes with bike ped facilities as well. And then we've also identified on Reith Road, roundabouts at 2 locations. So once again, wanted to take a moment to pause for questions or comments about Midway.
Any questions or comments about the Midway area? All right, I'm not seeing any.
Okay, great. So we have the Kent Industrial Valley next. So this, of course, takes into consideration projects that were proposed as part of the Rally the Valley process. And so we have a few projects identified here, including one-way separated bike facilities on 208, as well as a shared use path on 212th Street to be separated from the roadway, as well as another shared use path and sidewalk improvements on 259th. So we've also included a couple grade separation projects. So those are identified at the Union Pacific Railroad and the BNSF Railroad crossing along 212. That I'll pause again to see if there are any questions.
All right.
Madam Chair, excuse me.
Councilmember Thomas.
So April, those bypass, excuse me, grade separations there on 212, you got 2 of them really close together, is that correct?
Yes, so that's 2 of them. It's on 2 different railroads, so Union Pacific and the BNSF.
Right, right. No, I understand that, but how expensive are we talking there for rail? I mean,
So those projects, road grade separations, and Rob is also on the phone, so you can correct my numbers, are the most expensive probably by far on this project list. And they're in the range of 40 to 50 million. And Rob can correct me if I'm correct, if I'm wrong. One of the things, so these two projects are on that supplementary project list that I described earlier. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we got feedback from the public is to make sure that we didn't forget anything, and we were hearing from the public on their reaction to these. So this project list that is in your packet, this is not the final project list on everything that's going to the TMP. This is the ones that are rising to the top that based on the performance measures and some other select criteria, like if it was a funded project or something along those lines, these are the ones we'd like to take to the public and get their reactions so we can cool down further, but they are very expensive.
My first reaction is, yeah, they are expensive. And is it really, I mean, that necessary for a sidewalk and pedestrian for a grade separation? I'm trying to justify it here in my mind.
So,
okay.
No, you're good. Fundamentally, I'll let Rob step in to kind of explain grade separations, but fundamentally they are both a congestion project. They can have bike ped facilities, but they are a safety project.
I will. Thank you very much, April. This is Rob Brown, Transportation Engineering Manager. Councilmember, that is a great comment, great question. As April said, the grade separations are primarily safety projects. They separate all those lanes of traffic from train traffic, and they're also, as April said, a congestion relief project. On the BNSF lines, we have somewhere between 40 and 60 trains a day, which every time a train goes by, that stops traffic on 212 for anywhere between 45 seconds to a couple minutes, depending on what type of train it is going through. So they do fall under both of those, but included in the grade separations are also those pedestrian and bicycle facilities that go along with them. So it's a combination project.
Oh, now I'm beginning to understand. So this is not just pedestrians and bikes, this is cars as well. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay,
sir,
that makes more sense. I'm sorry. That's better. Thank you very much.
Thanks for jumping in, Rob. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, this is Councilmember Lemmer. I have a question on project MIC 14. Can you tell me how that one's sort of rising to the top? I'm really curious because, it's a very small, windy, steep road. I just don't foresee it being, I don't see a whole lot of bikers using it because of the way it is now, and even with improvements. And I don't even know where you'd put a roundabout on that. So I just have a lot of questions on that one.
So partly connectivity. So there is not a lot of options for pedestrians in that area of Kent to get across State Route 167. Really, the only option that's nearby is South 212th Street,
212,
including the on and off ramps. One of the things that we struggled with, and that it's just the nature of the topography of the city of Kent, is in many places there is not very many or if any good options for bicycle and pedestrians. But providing the option is still important. And when we looked at connectivity in this area of Kent to get from the East Hill down into Industrial Valley, this is the one that really rose to the top as the one that was feasible and that could be constructed.
Okay, I just think, as a bicyclist or a pedestrian, I would, much rather use 212. I definitely would not prioritize this project myself.
Madam Chair.
Councilmember Thomas. Go ahead.
Okay, now I'm on, I think. So, so I'm in complete agreement here with Councilmember Larmer, because that hill, I don't see very many pedestrians using that area. That hill is amazing curves. We used to call it Snake Hill. So anyway.
Still do.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm not that old then.
So I will take that feedback and go back to the list and see and look at what the other options that we looked at, so we can have a better understanding. There's a lot of projects in the list, and that's what I remember on why this one came to the top, is those connectivity and the best options of not a great many options. But I'll go back look at our list to make sure that I'm not missing something.
Thank you.
And I'd be curious to see what feedback we had from anybody that's using that as a bike path. Because my guess is there's something that you saw there that made it an important project. So.
Well,
And one other note on that. So there is at 92nd a roundabout. So one of the things that a roundabout can do is make it kind of slow the speeds and make it a more conducive environment for bicycle and pedestrians as a mode of travel, and discourage kind of cut through traffic as well.
Madam Chair, again, if I may.
Yeah, I think Councilmember Fincher has her hand up. So I'm going to go to Councilmember Fincher and then we'll come back to you, Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. Just to tag on what you're saying, the Bicycle Advisory Board, I believe that you guys had already talked to them previously, but to make sure that they're included in the follow-up conversations also.
This will be an agenda. The project list will be an agenda item, hopefully at their next meeting. I'm not sure if they've been able to meet remotely yet. I need to talk to Rob. But the intent is to their next available where they can, where it's a remote meeting or in person, or at the very least, we'll be communicating and asking for feedback via email if a meeting is not possible.
All right, Councilmember Thomas, you had a follow-up question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, back to MIC 14. I think a big reason for this, I'm beginning to understand why it's on there. It's more for safety than anything else, because bicycles and cars on that road would not mix well at all. So I could kind of understand why it's on the map now. All right, thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
All right, looks like we can move on.
Great. Thanks for that great feedback. So now we have Northeast Hill. And so we have identified a few projects. You'll see bike lanes and greenways. Of course, the greenways are similar to those low speed, low volume roads we showed the example of earlier. And then we have identified intersection improvements across Northeast Hill, and more bicycle lanes and pedestrian facilities. Do we have any specific questions about this area?
I have a comment on
Sure.
East Hill 33. I know that was on the sort of supplemental list, but I would consider, I would like us to take a second look at maybe prioritizing that one, because I think it not only would an intersection there increase school safety, there's some major development going on to the north of that, that area that, I know that there's I see a lot of kids walking to the high school, but then there's also the connection with the Zeus Creek Trail right there too. So it may not have fit on a corridor, but I'm wondering about some school safety issues there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
So we'll add that. That is one of the projects that was identified as something that was missing from the list. And I strongly suspect this one came from Rob Brown. I don't have a name next to it though. And some of those kind of improvements along with the intersection, these are kind of the critical comments we're hoping to hear on what we missed from this list.
Also a question or comment from Councilmember Michaud.
Thank you, Council President. April, I'm wondering about number 20 on here. I noticed in the packet that it's a tier 2, and I'm just wondering why it's a tier 2 when the 132nd project south of 240th is a tier 1, because I know that 132nd north of 240th can get really backed up.
part of that has to do with location specific. So a lot of the performance metrics are really based on key things. For example, is there equity populations near it, which would benefit from that project? Is there a density of destinations, which would make that project more critical than in areas that are more residential? So those kind of factors will play into the score that the performance metric that was assigned by staff and with the assistance of the consultants. And so that likely plays into why one segment of 132nd scored in the first tier, while the second segment scored in the second.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, thank you.
Thank you. So now we're approaching our last sub area. So we have identified a few key corridor projects, including a conversion of 132nd from 2 to 3 lanes to allow room for multimodal improvements, to accommodate that. And then we have 248th as well, similarly 2 to 3 lane conversion. That would include a physically separated bikeway and intersection improvements. And then we have identified a number of neighborhood greenway improvements across the Southeast Hill area that are grouped in that SE Hill 14 identification. So once again, I want to take a moment to stop to ask to see if there are any questions.
Councilmember Larmer.
Yeah, so I see that on project 7, there is improvements at 116th and 248th. But if I recall, I think it was just down there the other night, on 116th and 256th, it feels like, I think we might have missing sidewalk on the northwest corner, or an incomplete. So I was a little curious why that intersection was not called out.
So one of the things that's difficult is that staff, we looked at a total of 136 different corridors, and every single project on that list is important and critical, but not all of them necessarily advance the goals as much as other projects. And so I suspect if it's sidewalks on 116th, I know 116th was one of the corridors that were applied the metrics. It did not score in one of the top tiers. If it's the intersection improvements on Southeast Hill 27 on 256, if they're near that intersection, that could be possibly a way we could add that to that project to make sure that they're included in that corridor.
All right, any other questions about the Southeast Hill projects? Okay, I don't see any hands raised.
267, huh?
So all of these projects, and we really only went over kind of some of the projects in the packet that I'm not sure if it was sent to you by email, but I'm pretty sure, I know it was sent out. All of those packets include all of the projects on those top 42 corridors that rose to the top based on the performance metrics and really advanced the adopted goals as based on the performance metrics that were also adopted. So this leads us kind of to our next step. Input from the City Council and the public is important at this point. It's important to understand of the projects that are advancing the goals, which ones really are the critical projects from the perspective of the public and from the City Council that really need to end up on this, the top project list for the TMP. Another piece is also the funding that Kendra has already gone over that we'll do a deeper dive on. There is limited funding, and I wish we could do every single project on the expanded project list because all of them were great projects and served a portion of the city of Kent. But we can't. And so one of the things that we'll have to do after we hear from the public is to understand, now that we know what the top ones are, what can we actually afford and where are there opportunities to seek funding for different types and different project locations. So tonight I am asking from the City Council to have a better understanding of how you feel about the project list and the corridors that we've identified at the staff level with the performance measures. How did we do? What did we miss? What needs to be added that's a critical one that we didn't flag for another reason? There is a lot of perspectives from economic development, from parks, from public works that went into developing this to try to hear as many voices as we could and perspectives to ensure that this is a very well-rounded project list that serves as many of the City of Kent residents and businesses as we can. But it's also important to kind of hear and stop and pause and hear from you and understand what on this project list do you not feel is quite as important and what did we miss, and get that feedback back. And then the next step is to also go to the public and find out and hear that same thing from them. I am planning on being back on August 11th. You'll be seeing me a lot more often remotely, likely. And on August 11th, I'll be coming back with the project list that's been updated based on any input that I hear from you to ask and make sure that this is a project list that you're comfortable going to public outreach with.
All right, so just for clarification, April, you kind of want some input from us right now on what you've shown us. You're going to come back on April 11th and we'll look through the list again, and then you'll take that list out for public outreach. Is that correct?
Correct. It was important to make sure that this did not happen in a silo. And that was one of the things that's been a key piece throughout this process, that we heard all the voices on staff. We heard as many voices, including equity populations from the public. But it's also to hear from you and find out where the holes are now before we go to public outreach, so we can try to make sure we incorporate them as well.
Great. And I like that. I like that you're continuing to bring this forward so we can see how this list is developing. Council member comments or questions? Councilmember Boyce, do you have something?
Thank you, Madam Chair. April, your team did an awesome job. You know, at the end of the day, there are so many projects and it costs so much money, and you know, there's only so much we can do, right? So the part that I guess I like about this year, number one, is just the cross-functional work that your team have done, you know, between public works and parks, and I'm sure ECDC. I mean, everybody working together as a team, right? And I think at the end of the day, you know, there's not enough money in the bucket really to get everything done. So I look at this earlier and I look at it again afterward. But I think initially, I kind of like what I see, but you know, it's just that it's when you have so much need, it's kind of hard to really try to, you know, and all the needs is a deep need, right? So it's just hard to kind of figure out what's go first, right? So I just want to say my initial read on this here, I mean, I don't have any major objection to it, but I will take a closer look at it. But I just want to say, and this for the mayor as well too, just with the team working together, looking at this list, bringing a holistic approach, I think that's a really good thing. So thanks for all the work you guys have done. Thank you. Great comment, Councilmember. Councilmember Fincher.
Thank you, Council President. I just wanted to say I really appreciate, because from the very beginning, April and her team were talking about equity in this. So I appreciate the outreach to a lot of those voices that we don't normally hear from. So the extra effort, I know every time I sent her a list are, you know, names that she gladly took those. So thank you for reaching out to our full community.
Thank you. Kind of echoing on what Councilmember Boyce and Fincher said, you've done a great job with this, you and your team, and I think finding money to do all of these projects is one of the most difficult pieces, but you guys have taken so much time and you're continuing to work with every department to make sure that when we have this list, that it fits the needs of our entire community. And that's a lot of work. So I want to say thank you for all you're doing to make sure you're reaching all of the people that this affects. So any other questions or comments? All right, I don't see any hands raised. I think we gave you a few things to look at, but we've seen this multiple times, and I think you've done a great job.
You, and I know we're over, so I'm gonna try to kind of quickly go through the remainder of the slides just to give you a sense. And I am always available if you want to call and ask any questions or walk through the project list. Just give me a call. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to address really quickly is the fact that outreach is going to be challenging in the time of COVID. There's no good way to say it's not going to be challenging. So one of the things that I've been working with the consultant team is to understand how we can engage and reach especially equity populations, but really everyone in this time. And so we're going to be using a lot of old school kind of methods. We're going to be going to posters at essential locations and transit centers. I'll be talking with Bailey, who's next up, to make sure that we're getting out on social media blasts and giving as many options as possible. We've created quick fact sheets that we're going to use to walk the public and businesses as well through equity and how we got to this project list. And we're going to base that and kind of ground that in making sure we're reaching these equity populations. And by going to different nonprofits that serve them, by, if we need to, going to the actual businesses and contacting and going back to kind of the roots and making sure that we reach them in any way possible, but reach them in the way that is conducive to receive feedback from them. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily Alice to really quickly go over the very last slide.
Yes, very quickly. Next slide. Thank you. So of course, we are finalizing the project corridors list. We've got a lot of great feedback tonight, and April, of course, is receptive to hearing more from this group and others. And then, of course, August 11th, April and likely myself will return to this council to present the draft project corridors list, which would then move forward to public outreach. So we've provided examples of how we plan to do that in this COVID-19 era and reach communities the best we can. Then once we have that outreach, we'll synthesize what we've heard and refine the project corridor list again. And then once again, refining it to understand what is fiscally feasible, what is an option given our current funding reality. And last but not least, drafting the TMP report. We've had some time, the consultant team and the staff have been working closely together to start drafting the report so that it's not a behemoth waiting for us at the end of this process. So that is a continual process, and I know this group will look forward to reviewing that once it's wrapped up. So with that, April, I can turn it over to you.
Thank you for having us. My apologies, Bailey, for going over.
Thank you so much, everybody. We all received the packet in email today, so I encourage you to, if you haven't had a chance, I can tell from some of your comments and questions that you guys have been doing your homework and have had a chance to look through the packet. But if you have any other comments or questions, please make sure you do reach out to April. All right, it looks like we are ready to move on. I'd like to welcome Bailey Stover. He is going to give us one of several communications updates that we'll be having at these workshops so we can learn more about what's happening. So welcome, Bailey.
Thank you, Council President Troutner, Mayor Ralph, members of the council, Bailey Stover, Communications Manager for the city. And as the council president indicated, this is one of several communications updates we'll be doing. My plan for tonight is to walk you through some of the reorganization we've been doing in communications and how it's going to improve some of our efficiencies and outcomes. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about a COVID-19 public education campaign that we're going to be launching here shortly that you all will get to be a part of. And then in subsequent communications updates, we'll talk a little bit more about the communications and public relations plan and some of our external outreach strategies. So with that, I will dive right in to the next slide. So this is the previous organizational chart when I took over as interim communications manager. So you had a communications manager position, and then under that communications manager position in the mayor's office, you had a neighborhood programs position and an external relations coordinator position. And both of those roles were focused on external work and external relations, as where the communications manager was supporting the 10 departments of the city, as well as the city council, mayor's office, and the liaison with RFA and emergency management. Decentralized you had a multimedia team that was housed over in information technology with Patty as the multimedia manager, followed by 5 folks on the multimedia team there. Also decentralized, each department had, the external facing large departments had some sort of communications function. Now, everybody's got a different job description with those external departments, but they all had some sort of communications function to their work. So you had a communications coordinator in public works, communications coordinator in economic and community development, communications coordinator for parks and human services, and then 2 community education positions over in the police department. So what we kind of experienced was we were all working on some sort of comms, and it was very decentralized, not coordinated. We weren't getting the results that we wanted. We had some people on different pages than others, and it just really was an inefficient model where projects were taking longer, turnaround time was taking longer, and we weren't having the desired outcome we wanted for our internal communications or our external communications. So we decided to do a little bit of reorganizing to try and centralize some of the services that we offer to our residents and the information that we wanted to get out. So I can get the next slide, please, Kim. So we've done some reorganization, and I'll walk you through it here, but the shapes here that have color to them are now a centralized communications team. So as your communications manager, I'm overseeing all of the citywide communications, both internal and external, but I'm also covering the mayor, the city council, and the administration department. Patty Bell has come over from IT and is now housed in the communications division here in the mayor's office and still remains the multimedia manager, but she's taken on some additional supervisory responsibilities to help coordinate our team. So starting on the left column, you'll notice the folks that were over in IT under the multimedia division have come over and joined the communications division here in the mayor's office. Under Patty, directly under Patty, you'll see we actually have communications coordinators. So previously, where we had external facing positions, we've actually created some internal, some communication specific positions that are helping cover the previous 10 departments that I covered alone. So we have Josh Mossberg, who's joined our team, and Josh covers IT, finance, and public works. Tracy Padilla actually came over from HR. She was working in city HR, and that position was eliminated during COVID budget reductions, or transferred over during COVID budget reductions. And Tracy covers court, law, police, and HR. And then you've still got Yuri, who's helping us run all of our external relations programs. But what we did is we merged neighborhood councils with external relations. It's a natural fit. It made sense. It's still external facing, and you still have a direct liaison between the neighborhoods and the mayor's office and the council, working to build that two-way communication back and forth. What we've done additionally, which I'll cover here in a second, is we've launched our internship program again in administration. And I'll cover that momentarily, where I talk about and introduce you to some of the interns that we've brought on here. But I do want to point out the bottom right corner of this organizational chart shows you we still do have some decentralized communications. So we've left decentralized communications in economic and community development, and we've also left decentralized communications with parks and human services. Parks just being a huge department, and they have various needs, varied needs. And so it made sense to leave those positions there. And the police department still has 2 community education specialists that work on things like their block watch, their residence academy, their coffee with the chief events. So they're still participating there. Next slide, please. So we've launched the administration's internship program. It's a program that existed last year, kind of went dormant for a few months. And then with COVID, definitely took a little bit of a break, but we've been able to bring that back. And so I wanted to introduce you to a couple of the interns and talk to you about what they'll be doing here at the city. So Haley Cummins, born and raised in Kent, lives up on the East Hill, currently a senior at Seattle University, majoring in strategic communications. So she'll be helping us with some things like our communications planning and long-term and long-range planning with our communications. Fernando Campos actually just got out of the Navy from the area here. He's also a senior at Seattle University. He's majoring in organizational leadership as well as criminal justice. Cassie Fowler lives here in Kent. She's just looking to learn more about local government and how that impacts city services and how those city services then in turn impact residents. We've also hired Maria. Maria is a recent graduate of the University of Washington, Tacoma. She's interested in local policy, and Maria specifically will be helping us on COVID-19 outreach. So she's going to be helping us do some of our business outreach, as well as some resident outreach programs that I'll cover here in the next few slides. And then Sydney is with us just as a short-term intern. She's actually only got a couple weeks, but wanted to get some experience, and we wanted to provide her with that opportunity. She's going to school at Eastern Washington University and is very involved in her student government, and so wanted to take some of this experience back to EWU and share her experience with the city of Kent. Next slide, please. So we've changed the way that we serve our departments since we've changed our organizational structure. So now when a department has a need, they submit a ticket, and we have a ticketing system that we've rolled out citywide. That ticket comes in and it goes to Patty and I, and we sort out who's the appropriate liaison. So as I noted previously, Josh is covering IT, finance, and public works, and Tracy is covering the police department, courts, law, and HR. So when we get a ticket from a department, it goes to the correct communications coordinator for that department, who then acts as the consultant for that project. So the communications coordinator then creates a plan to fulfill that need from the department. So most of the time it's sending it over to multimedia for production, whether it's a video production, photography, graphic design. But then they also coordinate with our external relations team with Yuri and his intern to decide what types of events are appropriate. Whether it's public works that needs a neighborhood meeting around 4th and Willis, whether it's our police department who needs a community meeting or town hall, or whether it's a coffee and conversation event with the mayor. That communications coordinator sets out that course of action and sets out the best plan for reaching the most residents. And then we come together as a team to fulfill that need.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bailey, I'm interested here because this is my job at the UW, doing these charts. So the third one down, communication coordinator for the department. Are you sure that almost couldn't be eliminated so the multimedia manager goes directly to the communications coordinator? You know, eliminates, you have a lot of coordinators here.
So I think, Councilmember, maybe that I misworded this. It is the communications coordinator that is gone to. The reason that it says for the department is because some of our team is centralized and some is still decentralized. So if it were a request for HR, for example, they would go to Tracy, and Tracy would then create that plan and coordinate the moving pieces. As where if it were in economic and community development, it would still go to that department, but it would specifically go to Michelle, who's handling their communications.
All right. Thank you, Bailey.
Absolutely. Next slide, please. So some of our next steps that we're working on. So the first step that we wanted to do with our new model was create a SWOT analysis of citywide communications. So the executive leadership team of the city got together, brought the good, bad, the ugly, what's working, what's not working for citywide communications, and we created a SWOT analysis. The second thing we did is we held a team retreat, which was actually a 2-day event where the communications team went through the SWOT analysis to see what we could address and what were easy fixes to fix some of the citywide communications issues, and what we thought were longer term issues that either required resources or additional tools or things like that. So we've created our own SWOT analysis based off of the SWOT analysis that ELT has provided. And then the next thing that we're doing is going out to the departments and creating SLAs, which are service level agreements. I fundamentally believe that departments have, they have the right and should know what turnaround times they're going to get on projects, what options are available to them. And so by creating service level agreements, we create an above board expectation between the departments that we're serving and the centralized communications team to say, when you ask for something, here's when you can get it. Here's what the quality will be. Here's what the content will be. And so creating realistic agreements between departments and the centralized communications team, it makes everything go a lot smoother. It lets the departments know when they need to submit their work orders, the time for the turnaround, and when that product will be delivered. We're adding communications functions to the internal ticketing system that I described. That system's called Ivanti. It was recently rolled out through IT. And so we're adding additional communications functions to that ticketing system. So city employees and departments will be able to create the tickets that they need, and it'll get appropriately assigned to staff automatically. We're working to create a sustainable budget to execute the strategy. As we talked about at the council retreat, communications has had what I've been calling a quasi budget as far as it's paid for its staffing and benefits and some of the bare necessities, but it's never had an actual communications budget to proactively do outreach and engagement with our residents and business community. So we're going to examine more effective ways to determine our cost allocations after the data collection piece, which is a big component of that internal ticketing system. Right now, folks can request things from communications, and there's no data collection to decide what departments are using the most resources as where other departments are underutilizing resources. So we're going to be doing our data collection through our ticketing system and then finding more effective ways to determine our cost allocation. And lastly, once we have this model, or once we've had time in this model, identifying ways to strengthen the model, going back regularly and saying what's working and what's not working. You know, are we delivering on our service level agreements with departments? Is there still areas that we can do better? And how do we constantly make this a better model to really bring 21st century communications to our residents? It's the 6th largest city in the state. We've got to have a robust communications program, which means constantly reevaluating and refining how that looks. Next page, please. So this is something I'm super excited about, and I wanted to brief you. It's not directly tied to our new communications model, but I think it's really important. We are getting ready to kick off our COVID-19 campaign for our residents and businesses. It's an awareness and resource campaign. So through this, the city will actually be giving out 10,000 masks and 10,000 hand sanitizers to businesses and residents. Additionally, we've got 1,000 gaiters that are coming in and 1,000 masks to our city employees. So if you look up at the top of this, you'll see some of our mask designs that are coming in. They are super cool. I promise you, council, I'm already putting together your swag bags with your cool masks and sanitizers, but we're also going to be providing these to our employees as well as our residents and business community. We're going to provide informational handouts and resources to our community with a variety of platforms. We'll be doing 6 overpass banners at Veterans Drive, James Street, Footbridge, and the 277th overpass, as well as 10 4x8 foot large aluminum signs directing folks to our COVID-19 resources. Also, we're kind of going old school and doing mail. So we'll be doing 3 jumbo-sized postcard mailers because we recognize social media doesn't hit everybody. We've got a large population who's not on social media or doesn't follow the city. So we're going old school and putting mailers in people's mailboxes. We're doing 1 mailer that goes to all residents citywide. We're doing 1 mailer that goes to residents over the age of 55, in addition to the first mailer they got, because they're a higher risk resident population. And then our 3rd mailer is going to everybody with a city business license, letting the businesses know about the resources that we have for them as far as COVID-19. Additionally, we're going to be still doing our digital ads on a website, as well as our social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram. And lastly, we'll be doing some Pandora radio ads to target Kent residents and businesses and let them know about the resources we have for them at absolutely no cost to them. The one thing I wanted to point out is every packet that we're giving out on COVID-19 is also going to contain census information. We really want to encourage our residents to get our census numbers up. We are 0.7% away, 0.7% away from our 2010 census numbers. Nationally right now, the trend is most cities are about 18% lower than where they were in 2010. And we are almost dead even, and we will surpass that number by the time this is over. So we've got an opportunity here where we're giving out 10,000 masks and 10,000 hand sanitizers and a bunch of other things where we can include that census information and really try to engage our residents on the census as well as our COVID-19 engagement campaign. Next slide, please. So with that, I wanted to open it up for questions. I realized that was probably a lot of information to digest as far as our reorganizational structure and our workflow processes. You know, the goal really was to make a team that's more efficient. We did it without adding any FTEs. We did it without any budget impacts. It's revenue neutral there. and trying to make a more efficient communication structure so we have solid internal and external communications for both our employees and our residents and businesses. And then the last piece was just updating you all on the COVID campaign we're getting ready to launch. So I'd be happy to take questions, Madam President.
Thank you so much, Bailey. Couple hands raised. I'm going to start with Councilmember Larmer. Then we will move on to Councilmember Boyce and Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you. So Bailey, first, I just want to say that I'm really excited to see the reorganization. I've worked in large organizational corporate communications now for 20 some years, and I've worked both in decentralized teams where your specialists are embedded with the departments, and then I've worked in central where everybody's centralized. And I've always found that I think a more consistent model for voice, for tone, for reaching your audience is always that centralized model. So I think we're definitely, we've organized into a more effective trajectory. And so I appreciate that. And I want to applaud the work that went into that. I'm also really excited to see the strategic piece. And do you know, like, when we might, as a council, see sort of a strategic communications plan, sort of that long range vision you were talking about?
Yeah, I know that I'm coming back to a council meeting soon. I don't know a specific date yet because I'm not sure it's been set. But what you'll see, what I'm bringing back to you is our long range strategic communications plan. I'm also bringing you a separate public relations plan that talks about specifically our external outreach and community relationship building, because I think that's a separate but very important piece that goes hand in hand with our communications plan. My guess, if I had to guess, I would say it's probably going to be back to you within the next 60 days, preferably sooner. But I know I'll be working with the council president and CAO to get that on the agenda. So I know you'll see something very soon, council member.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Good job.
Thank you.
Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Madam President. Hey, Bailey, how you doing, buddy?
I'm good, sir. How are you?
Good. Hey, a couple of questions. The first one around the neighborhood program. Tony used to lead that. There's a lot of, there's some good things, and I'm sure that thing need to be tweaked. So I'd be interested to see how that's going to go forward.
We're just still in the end here.
How that's going to go forward, right? And then my second question is around with the masks, the 10,000 masks. Is that something you're going to send communication out? Do citizens come and pick it up from the city, or how did that process going to work?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I want to be really transparent. The Neighborhood Council program was, I think, a very good program in concept. It was the delivery over the course of years where it kind of fell off the wagon a little bit. So when I came on as interim communications manager, I did an evaluation of all of the programs that fell out of the mayor's office and communications just to see where we're at. And what I found with the Neighborhood Council program is we have 50 recognized neighborhood councils. And when I emailed those neighborhood councils to introduce myself and ask if I could come to one of their meetings, what we really have in Kent is about 12 neighborhood councils that are meeting on a regular basis. I had people email me back that say they haven't lived in Kent in 5 or 6 years, and they have no clue how they're listed as a neighborhood council president. So what we're going to be doing in the mayor's office is reimagining neighborhood councils and the way that we do our community outreach to make sure that we have more voices and actual reflected voices at the table with our neighborhood councils. So what we've been doing right now is kind of a research program where we've been looking at our surrounding cities as well as other cities in the country to see how they do their neighborhood programs. And the one thing that I've really been pushing our team is we need diversity in our neighborhood council program. We need the actual community to be involved, which means we need to make the program accessible. We need to make the information accessible, and we need to meet the community where they're at rather than expecting them to come to us. So I will tell you right now, the Neighborhood Council program is still alive for the active neighbors and neighborhood councils that are participating. We are still here to serve them. We're excited to serve them, but we are looking for ways to improve the program, to make it impactful and resourceful for the neighbors and residents that are living in Kent. But I'm expecting soon we're going to have a new kick butt program that you all can be proud of as council. The second question you had was on the distribution of the PPE supplies and resource cards and things like that from the city. So we're going to be doing a lot of partnerships with our nonprofit community and organizations and getting them distributed through them, as well as some of our business groups and chambers we will partner with to get them distributed. We're also potentially partnering with Pacific Coast Produce, who got the USDA contract here in Kent and is doing food distribution. We're going to try to partner with them to distribute some of our PPE supplies out with the food distribution. So it'll go out through a variety of channels, but there will absolutely be communication. For businesses, we're already working on an online sign-up form where they can tell us how many kits they need, and we can get those organized and delivered to those businesses or set a time for pickup. And for residents, there will be a ton of external communication to come take advantage of these free resources. And it will be spread geographically throughout the city, as well as spread out through times and dates to make sure that it's available for everybody and we're meeting people where they're at.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate that, buddy. Thank you very much.
Excellent question. Thank you, Councilmember.
Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Madam President. Bailey, things look really good here. I'm excited for you and your staff that you've got going. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential here. My question was back to your sustainable budget. Does that, most of your funding come just right out of the general fund then? Or do you have some other method or means?
Yeah, Councilmember, great question. We are considered general fund. And what I meant by the sustainable, and so cost allocation, for example, I was looking with finance at our cost allocation model today. And as an internal service, our cost allocation is based off of metrics like overall city budget, overall city FTEs, and total agenda items that go through the agenda. So we're looking at what makes sense as far as sustainability. But what I mean when I say a sustainable long-term budget is, are we setting aside money to do actual communication? And I'll tell you, I'll give you the perfect example here. We wanted to do an end of year report card last year to our residents, letting them know what our departments had accomplished. What was the one thing they were proud of that residents should really know about? And I went to do the mailing because we were going to do a mailing because it reaches the most people in Kent. And we actually didn't have a mailing budget for communications. So I actually went around to all the departments and asked them for money. PD kicked in $3,000. I think Parks kicked in $3,000. IT kicked in $1,500. I had to go around and ask to make up the mailing costs. So what I'm saying when I say budget is actual set aside money for us to do communications with our residents to let them know what they're getting and what services we have available to them as a city.
But you do understand that, just like we started out in the previous delivery, that there are so many needs out there, that we have to prioritize. And, I'm sure they hadn't considered mailing there when they did the budget, but maybe this year we can consider it and add it to your budget. So we'll see how things go here.
Yeah, absolutely, Councilmember. I think that's a great point, and I'm all about the prioritization. Even with the last presentation with the Transportation Master Plan, it's important that we have communications tools so we can solicit resident input on those important plans and projects that we're planning for short-term and long-term as a city. But I totally
agree. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any other questions or comments for Bailey? All right, I don't see any hands raised. Great job, Bailey. Looking forward to hearing more about this group at an upcoming meeting.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. All right, we have come to the end of our workshop. So, and it looks like we are right on schedule. You have a little bit of time before you can join us back here at the council meeting at 7 p.m. So thank you everyone for joining us. We are adjourned.
Cart before the horse, because don't we really need to have those conversations and come together as a community. Because I'm getting this feeling too that even with some of the tools that have been provided, that there's still this underlying pain, resentment, bitterness, anger from what has happened in the past, that really needs to be resolved, because even when those tools are provided, it's still not getting us where we need to be.
I would agree with you, and I would say that it is not a dichotomous binary. It is a both and, right? Because the tools have to come, and we can't wait on the tools, and the conversation has to come, and we can't wait. We can't wait to have the conversation to provide more tools, and we can't wait for more tools to have the conversations. It's really a both and, which is why I go back to this idea of decentering the idea of norm, right? Because that's where everything really hinges on. The pain of the now is that there is still an idea that there is one norm, that there are not multiple norms, and what's normative for you may not be normative for me, or may not be normative for your neighbor. So the conversations have to happen.